I think a lot of people really struggle with the story that we read this morning from the Gospel of John. The same story that is told really in all of the Gospels of Jesus in the temple in Jerusalem. And Jesus, well, is mad. I mean, he almost seems to be having a tantrum. He's overturning tables and shouting and screaming and whipping at animals and ordering people around. It goes against so much of the image of Jesus we seem to have in our minds. Gentle Jesus, meek and mild. Is this the same man who taught his followers to turn the other cheek, to love their enemies? How could the one who came to save all humanity show this kind of anger? And these are all really good questions. And I think there are some ways of working through those questions. And I want to do that this morning by trying to focus in on a particular object. An object that is only explicitly mentioned in John's gospel, but that is kind of taken for granted in the others. And the object I'm talking about is, of course, a whip. I was struck by John's note in his gospel that Jesus made a whip out of cords. So struck, in fact, that I had you folks make a whip today. Now, I didn't do that without second-guessing myself a little bit. Yes, I had a little bit of trouble with the idea of asking kids to make what is, essentially a weapon. I, like any experienced father, imagined scenes of kids using the whip against each other. And then, of course, I imagined parents getting very angry with me. But you know what? It says in the Bible that Jesus made a whip. So how could I possibly be blamed for having us follow the example of Jesus? But let me ask you a question here for a moment. Why did Jesus make the whip? He made it on the spot. And that simple fact that Jesus made it on the spot indicates that this whole thing was really not planned. It's a surprising note in the Gospel of John, because John actually often insists that every step of what Jesus did while he was in Jerusalem, it was all preordained. Jesus knew it was going to happen, and he made sure that it would happen in exactly that way. But in this passage, John seems to indicate that Jesus really hadn't planned this. It just kind of happened when he went into the temple. He saw what was going on, and he picked up some rope and some cord that was lying around in any busy marketplace. He braided it all together into a whip on the spot. It was not pre-planned. Rather, Jesus got swept up in a moment. And of course, the big question of this story, therefore, is what made Jesus so upset in that moment? It's not as easy a question to answer as you might think. The temple in Jesus' day was a massive complex. It encompassed probably about 2 football fields of space. And in the temple, there were places for everyone. There were courts for women. There were courts for the Gentiles and for Jewish men, and places reserved for the priests. The temple was also the biggest marketplace in the city of Jerusalem, in all likelihood. And it kind of had to be, because it was the only place where Jews were allowed to sacrifice. And that meant, for the majority of people, it was the only place they could go to actually supplement their diets with meat. Because, of course, the meat of the sacrifices was eaten by the worshipers. But since the temple in Jerusalem had a monopoly on sacrifice, there was no place else to go. And so many people traveled great distances to sacrifice at Jerusalem. And they obviously could not bring their sacrificial animals with them all that way. They had to buy one when they arrived. There were also money-changing booths in the temple. These two were absolutely necessary. The money changing, by the way, was not the fault of the Jews, but rather of the Romans. Because, you see, the Romans circulated coins, and on those coins were images of emperors. And the images They were images that the coins themselves proclaimed to be images of gods. And the law of Moses was absolutely clear on this point. There were to be no graven images of gods, especially not in the temple. And so the coins had to be exchanged for a currency that people could use in the temple. All of these things were absolutely necessary in order for the temple to continue to exist and for the people to be able to worship and eat. These things made it possible for the temple to function as a house of prayer for the people of all nations. And that's what it was. And so when Jesus walked into the temple that day, he saw something going on that was so disturbing, he felt he had to do something about it. And so he grabbed the only thing available at hand, some bits of rope and cord, and he made a whip. The whip was a symbol of his anger for what he saw going on. But what was it? What got him so angry? If you read the Gospel of John this morning, you get the impression that the issue that Jesus was concerned about was the marketplace itself. Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace, he cries. That's all he says. But that's a little bit puzzling. If that's what made Jesus angry, the existence of a marketplace, because as I said, the temple had always been a marketplace. It needed to be a marketplace in order to continue to fulfill its proper function. So basically, if Jesus was trying to shut down the market, what he was essentially doing was shutting down the whole institution. And I think that's essentially part of what was going on here. You see that in what Jesus goes on to say. Destroy this temple, he says, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Oh, and I know. John reassures us that when Jesus said that, he wasn't talking about the actual temple. He was talking about his own body. But you need to realize that by the time this gospel was written, the temple in Jerusalem had already been destroyed. The readers of this gospel could not help but make a connection between what Jesus had done and the ultimate destruction that was anticipated. At the very least, Jesus seemed to be pointing out the fragility of the temple as an ongoing institution in that society, and he was anticipating the need to think of it in new ways. But there are also other accounts in the other Gospels of what Jesus said in the temple that we need to take into account here. According to the Gospel of Mark, Jesus created a disturbance in the temple, saying this, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers?" Rather than being concerned about the marketplace, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus talks about the need for the temple to be a house of prayer for all people from all nations. And as I already mentioned, it was such a place. There was an entire court in the temple that was set aside for the people of the nations to come and pray. So that wasn't the problem. The problem was, according to Mark, that the place had become a robber's den. And I think a lot of people have misunderstood this. People have heard this accusation and assumed that, well, what it means is there must have been some shady things going on in the temple. I got to tell you, I remember when I was younger, hearing sermons about how the temple system in Jerusalem must have been dedicated to ripping people off, and how people were being overcharged for their sacrificial animals and being swindled in the money changing. And yes, indeed, that would be a serious problem. That would be something that would be worthy of making Jesus very angry. But the fact of the matter is there is no evidence at all that that kind of thing was going on in Jerusalem in the first century. And in any case, that's not what Jesus is saying is happening. Note that Jesus does not call the temple a crime scene. He calls it a robber's den. A den is not where robbers rob. It's the place where they come back to after they have finished robbing. The den is the place where the robbers feel safe, maybe where they store their ill-gotten gains, but it's not where they rob people. So Jesus is not accusing people of robbing or stealing or swindling people in the temple. The accusation he makes against the temple points to a much more insidious danger. The real danger that Jesus was pointing to, and I do not believe that this was a danger that was particular to that temple or to Jewish religion, but it's rather a danger that is common to all religion. And the danger is this: that we use our religious practices, our prayers, our sacrifices, and our religious observances to give to ourselves some sense of security, some sense that we are all right. Just like robbers are very comfortable in the robber's den, we use our outward shows of religiosity and righteousness to allow ourselves not to worry about things like systemic injustice or economic exploitation or hidden oppression, especially when we benefit from these things ourselves. And I cannot help but believe that it was that more than anything else that animated Jesus on that day. He was angry. He fell into a spontaneous rage. And I know we feel uncomfortable with that. We are nervous, of course, around anger and the expression of anger. In fact, sometimes we suggest that anger is an emotion that we must always suppress. But please understand that the emotion itself is not bad. Yes, there are bad ways to express or deal with anger, of course, but the emotion itself should not be feared if we can find ways of dealing with it that help instead of hurt. And indeed, suppressing anger can sometimes lead to very damaging effects, like mental health issues or the erosion of some of the key relationships in our lives. Suppressing anger is not the solution. So I think that we can look to Jesus and this story for a model in dealing with legitimate anger in helpful ways. Jesus takes his anger and uses it to do what? To make people think differently about what they are doing. He chooses to use it not to lash out at people, not to attack them or seek to hurt them, but rather to attack what he is concerned about, the comfort that they find in religion that makes it a safe den for robbers. That's what Jesus' whip represents. Many of you brought a whip to the service today. I asked you to make one, just like Jesus made one in the temple. And yes, Jesus' whip is a disturbing symbol. It is meant to be. So if you brought a whip today, I ask you to pick it up, if you have one. If you don't, imagine yourself holding a whip and look at your whip. As you contemplate it, I want you to ask a question. What makes you angry as you look at the world around you today? I'm not talking about the kind of anger that we experience when somebody hurts us or disrespects us or mistreats us personally. I mean, yeah, that's a legitimate anger, make no mistake. And we need to find productive ways to express that kind of anger when it arises. But that's not the kind of anger I want to focus on today. No, I want you to rather think on the things that are going on in the society around us. Things like systemic problems that maybe disadvantage certain people or groups. I want you to focus on the tendencies that you see eroding important things in our world, in our society. Are you thinking of something that, as you look at the world, just makes you mad, makes you upset. And we're not all thinking about the same thing. And we shouldn't be. But we should all be able to think of something, because I believe that these are issues that God lays on our hearts. Sometimes we suppress them. Sometimes we hide from them because we're afraid of the emotion of anger. But if we allow ourselves to be open to it, I believe God will show us, yeah, there are things, there is something out there to be angry about. So hold on to your whip. And as you hold on to it, think about how you can use your symbolic whip to make things less comfortable for those who perpetuate injustice in our world. What can you do to disrupt, not them, but their easy assumption that they are superior, that they are more righteous or more worthy, maybe because of their race or religion or mission? That's what Jesus was doing with his whip. He was stopping the temple from being a place where people could escape their complicity. So take up your whip. Wield it this week, in the weeks to come. Wield it with care and caution, but wield it. For this too is to follow the example of Christ. Lord Jesus, thank you. Thank you that you did get angry in the temple. You did it to show us that anger in itself is not something that's bad. It matters how we express it, and that we do so in constructive ways. But anger itself is not bad. Thank you for the anger you send us at the injustice in this world. Help us to find constructive ways to use that anger to build a better world just like you did. Amen.